She was left with nothing but a cow, and what she did with that single animal would unmake every easy assumption anyone had about loss, loyalty, and what it means to inherit a life. The wind on the mountain cut like thin glass. It stripped at the edges of Valentina's cardboard suitcase and made the rebozo over her shoulders clap against her back. She was 14 when she stepped off the dirt track that led away from the only house she had ever known, and Gitana, brown and white, patient-eyed, stood beside her as if answering a question no one had asked. Behind them, laughter came from the porch, a sound that tasted of triumph and tobacco. On the table inside, papers lay spread like confetti, signatures looping in an official hand. Her stepfather, Ricardo, and his brothers Matteo and Bruno had turned the death of Elena into a settlement, a tidy legal erasure. They called it paperwork. Valentina called it theft. She looked once at the roofline of the hacienda before she turned away. The silhouette of the house was ink against the pale sky, the almond trees in the yard reduced to the dark, brittle shapes of winter. She cupped the thin cardboard with a hand that still smelled faintly of lemon soap and her mother's perfume, an effort to keep herself from trembling. Gitana's rope was tied to the handle. The cow blinked slow and unconcerned, tail flicking away the flies as if nothing at all had changed. A man on the porch lifted a glass. "You're better off without her," Ricardo called, his voice crosshatched with a sneer. "You can't keep what wasn't yours." Valentina thought of the small, ragged fragment of Elena's rebozo she had tucked inside the suitcase, almost laughable in its dryness, felt the pressure of it under her palm. She remembered her mother's hands, the way they had folded linen and kissed the corners like promises. Elena had not been wealthy, but she had taught her daughter how to hold a pot over a fire, how to tease a knot free from a calf's halter, how to stitch a split palm with patient fingers. Elena had also taught her that the best inheritance was what you could pass on without paper. A craft, a name, a stubbornness that did not bend. They pushed her onto the road with more civility than a shove should allow. The Uncle Matteo, thin as a scythe, pushed the suitcase further with his boot and used 2 words like a final accounting. "You leave." Bruno laughed and spat, the sound like gravel. They stamped her childhood into the earth and walked back through the door as though the house itself had swallowed them whole. For a long stretch afterward, Valentina simply walked. The road was a waking memory of the funeral, the hot breath of the congregation, the slow lowering of a casket, the priest's voice that had felt distant, like chanting through cotton. She let the procession dissolve behind her, the flowers left to the sun. The suitcase thumped against her hip, an absurd, rigid thing filled with a few shirts the wrong size, a clay bowl, and the small silence of a life rearranged. Gitana walked at her side placidly, chewing the bitter stubble of roadside grasses, and the rope between them was a lifeline and a question. If someone had come along and looked at her then, young, thin, cheeks raw with the salt of sleepless nights, they might have written the epitaph of defeat. But Valentina had an eye for work, for the small practical miracles of necessity. She knew how to coax milk from a cow's belly before the dew had left the grass. She had been taught by a woman who could not be paper documented as an heir, the value of transforming the raw into the useful. The first night, the thought that kept her awake was not of revenge or restitution. It was a small, stubborn ledger in her head. Gitana's utter, one good milk morning could mean bread. When darkness hit, she found shelter beneath a low stone wall and leaned Gitana's flank against her knees. The cow's warmth was honest and immediate. The steady exhale against her ankle was a rhythm to sleep by. She opened the suitcase and drew out the bowl. The world smelled of crushed mesquite and wood smoke. The moon made the cardboard a pale coffin. She tried not to imagine the house with its shutters closed and the hijacked photographs hanging crooked on the walls. She woke before dawn. The world was thin and blue. Valentina's fingers were stiff but practiced as she felt for the cow's teats, angling her hand the way Elena had shown her, compressing gently, coaxing the milk into a rusted can she'd found behind a shuttered outbuilding on her first day out. The milk was warm and smelled faintly of the fields. She cupped it, watching the cream float like a small cloud. It was sustenance. It was everything. In town, San Miguel, men and women gathered around tables of old wood to drink bitter coffee and trade complaints. The market was a scrape of life at the valley's center, tongues of smoke, the sharp snap of cilantro being chopped, the chatter of barter. Valentina, with her small can and her quiet face, learned the unvarnished economy of survival. She traded a liter of milk to Don Arturo, the baker with the fat hands and flour on his shirt, and he slipped her a day-old bolillo warm from his oven. In exchange, he gave Gitana a place in his corral, and Valentina a corner by his oven where she could warm the milk and sleep when the weather turned to rain. He told her, as he pushed a brown roll into her hand, that everything had a price and everything also had value that was not cash. "Don't look at me like I'm charity," he said, his voice browned by years kneading dough. He was a man whose small, sturdy bakery had been there longer than anyone remembered. "You're better than that. If you want to trade your hands for bread, I'll trade you a loaf for a liter every morning. I don't do alms." There was an early, necessary dignity in his terms. Valentina accepted. The market became her training ground. She learned where the women set down their baskets, which stalls took the coin and which took the word of neighbors. She learned that a morning seller had to be there before light with goods neat in rows, and that the first bite taken by a passerby could be a promise of loyalty if it held a memory. Her milk sold to the men who wanted it raw to mix with coffee, to a woman with a young child who held out a cupped hand and tasted it like a benediction. But milk earned little beyond enough for a thin stew and a patch of soft hay for Gitana. Books, both in paper and in the mind, taught her that higher value lay in transformation. Cheese was a promise of that transformation. Elena's recipes lived as half-remembered prophecies in Valentina's head. The rhythm of heating, the patient wait for curds to separate from whey, the press that turned wet curd into a block you could carry to market and sell for 3 times what milk ever paid. When she thought of cheese, she could smell the copper pots in her mind, and it felt like home. The first person who saw beyond her liter can and the battered bowl was Doña Remedios. She was a streak of color in the market, an older woman who hawked embroidered napkins and who had a ledger of gossip tucked behind her heap of lace. She tasted Valentina's milk one morning while washing her hands, and her mouth puckered in that quick, pleased way that meant she'd found something true. "You have a cow, Niña," Doña Remedios said, half tasting, half deciding. "Why spoil the milk when you could give men something to talk about? The market is full of talk. Give them something worth talking about." When Valentina admitted she had thought of cheese but had no press and no copper pot, Remedios's eyes narrowed into a calculating glint. "Then you need hands that remember how. There is an old place on the hill, abandoned, for years. They say an old woman lives there, stubborn as a rock. Name is Doña Isabel. She had a press once before Rust took everything. People say she won't have company for free." Doña Isabel. The name came like a bell. Valentina had heard it whispered in the square, an elder with a past that smelled of smoke and sun-baked adobe. A woman who had once made cheese that found its way into city orders and into the mouths of people who paid more for story than for product. If a person could teach her to turn warm milk into something you could wrap and sell at a real price, it would solve more than a ledger problem. It would write her back into life. She walked to Isabel's place on the hill with Gitana following, the rope looped over her arm like a fragile noose of possibility. The old queseria stood gray and stubborn among scrub and mesquite, a low building of sun-baked brick with a roof patched from the years. Its door had been ajar for so long the hinges whined a welcome when Valentina pushed them. Inside, copper pots slumped like sleeping animals, a wooden press caked with old whey, a bench streaked with salt and stories. The woman who stepped out from the shadow did not move like a woman who had been broken. Isabel's shoulders were a low ridge under a blanket. Her hair was white and braided close to the scalp. Her hands, Valentina noticed, had the same streaks of old milk stains as Elena's. When Isabel looked at her, there was an arithmetic in the squint, a calculation of need, of stamina, of whether the girl would be worth the breath it took to teach. "You got a cow," Isabel said. Her voice had the gravitas of someone who had sat in courts of complaint and come away unchanged. "Most children want a ribbon or an animal toy. You got something that eats grass and gives." Valentina did not know to be small in the face of that regard. She answered plainly, "They left me with a cow. That is not a joke. It is everything I have." Isabel smelled like tobacco and lavender, an old cleaning solution. She looked at Gitana, who blinked slow, floored by the gentle gravity of a human who had known hardship longer than the cow had lived. A silence settled that felt like a test. "You work for it?" Isabel asked. It wasn't an offer, it was a condition. Valentina said yes. She said she had milked since she was a child. She said she could stand before the dawn and wash the can in a stream until it shone. She told a short, unadorned truth about the house and the papers and the men who had taken what they wanted. Isabel listened, one eyebrow raised like a weight on a scale, truth balanced against life. "Then you'll have to be ready to get dirty," Isabel said. "You'll have to be ready to wake before your bones tell you to. There's no fast way in this trade. We press slowly. We salt slowly. We wait. Do you know how to wait?" Valentina thought of the casket, the priest, the way time had been measured in the village since her mother died. She thought of mornings arranged around the ritual of feeding cattle, of the way patience could be a craft of its own. "I can wait," she said. So she stayed. The first days at the queseria were a litany of small repairs that humbled the body and honored a rhythm she had always half-sensed. They scraped mildew from copper pots with sand and lemon. They carried a ladder to the roof and pried away tiles that had been slipped like old teeth. The press's screw, rust-bound for years, complained in a long animal sound the first time Valentina wrapped a rag and turned it. Her hands were calloused and new at once, a paradox of strength and tender learning. Isabel gave her a space beneath a low window and an old blanket that smelled like sun and nothing else. She fed Gitana from the old trough and measured Valentina's progress with thin nods. At night, when the house held only the sound of wind and the cow's slow ruminations, Valentina would sit by the press and think of Elena's hands, mimicking them in the dark. She repeated the little pious phrases Elena had taught her, the practical prayers that are part toolkit, part memory. Check the temperature, never rush the curd, always skim the foam. The morning they made the first cheese, the light fell into the room like a blessing. Valentina stirred the milk in a heavy copper cauldron, the metal humming under the spoon. The curd formed like islands, soft, white, promising. She cut it carefully, as Elena had taught her, the edge of the knife dragging a thin ribbon of wet curd which smelled faintly of hay and milk warmed by the sun. She lifted it with a perforated shovel and coaxed it into cloth, cheesecloth that smelled of dust and linen, and then into the wooden molds that were scarred from 100 seasons. When they cinched the press, the first groan of the wood was a sound that found something in Valentina that had not yet learned to speak. It was a mechanical prayer, gravity doing work, the squeeze shaping the future. They waited, and the dripping whey fell into a basin and made a small, steady waterfall. Isabel watched, arms folded, the only motion of a head turning in appraisal. "Not bad," she said finally, and its tone was the rarest coin. Not bad from Isabel meant a kind of approval more durable than applause. The first tasting was a ritual. Isabel broke a small wedge and brought it to her mouth with the intensity of a sacrament. The cheese was young, salted but not brash, clean in texture, with a ghost of champurrado from the copper. The elder's eyes closed for the space of a breath. It was not only the technical deftness that pleased her, it was the echo of a life remembered, the texture of a childhood meal, the salt of a field after rain. She looked up at Valentina, and for the first time since the girl had arrived, smiled the kind of smile that reframed a person. "You have hands like your mother," Isabel said. She pressed like she meant to hold the world in one hand and hand it back with the other. Valentina's throat closed. She had never said Elena's name aloud in the hill's empty rooms. It was a secret prayer that made the air thicker. The words joined the bones of something inside her. Permission to grieve and permission to become. Word of the first cheeses moved slowly at first, like the spread of a river finding its tributaries. Don Arturo, who had tasted a wedge wrapped in a scrap of linen, nodded and said nothing for an hour, then the next morning bought around to serve with his coffee to the early bakers. A woman from the market who had seen Valentina's neat arrangement of jars and bowls went home and told her neighbor. The gossip twined around the square. A young girl making cheese, an old woman teaching her, an odd, good story in a town used to the ordinary cruelties of poverty and inheritance. Valentina sold the first rounds herself, in a morning when the sky was a precise blue. The sunlight on her hands made them look like tools being blessed. Her voice when she called out was small but steady. People bought, tasted, and came back with coins and nods. There were remarks, pity at first, then curiosity, then respect. A small crowd gathered not from charity but from the same clean human curiosity that made markets, the desire to know who could make something with honesty. She learned the ledger of customers by the way they spoke. A school teacher with soft fingers wanted a mild cheese for her morning pan. An old man with missing teeth wanted the sharpness that made it worth picking at a crust. A restaurateur in Guadalajara wanted samples, he said, with the detached hunger of someone who tastes for profit and prestige. Each person brought the possibility of more than subsistence. Yet for all the small victories, the road back to what her uncles had taken was a map sketched in the back of a purse, incomplete, messy, and driven by grudges. She had not forgotten that there had been a notary, with a pen that slid like a blade, a document signed in the scent of after-funeral smoke, a record that erased a life. The legalities were a separate field she did not yet know how to plow. She had Gitana, a press, and a patch of momentum. That would have to be enough for now. At night, the queseria held the imprint of labor. The press creaked, the copper pots glowed like old moons. Isabel told stories in the spaces between tasks, short, sharp histories of markets she had known, of cheeses that had crossed rivers for the taste of city mouths. She did not talk much about herself. When she did, it was with the careful distance of someone who had seen fortune come and go with equal indifference. "You want more than to survive?" Isabel told her late one evening, stirring a pot that held the faint ghost of curd. "That's a dangerous hunger." Valentina thought of the house and the way it now smelled like other people. She thought of the notion of home, a word that had been part shelter and part bruise. She had a hunger that was both righteous and personal. Not merely to eat, but to rebuild a place where a child could learn and a woman could age without being made small by a signature. She wanted to gather people into a place that could outlast a sheriff's tally or a notary's hand. That felt like too much sometimes. At other times, it felt like what her mother would have called necessary. The rest of the week was a blur of motion, milking at dawn, carts creaking down toward the market, the slow choreography of salting and drying cheese in the shade. Valentina's hands worked with an economy that made sense to her bones. She learned to salt with even strokes, to flip the rounds so their drying was symmetrical, to mark each wheel with a small notch that was a signature of intent. Customers learned to wait for the cheese to age properly, to trust the patience in each block. And as they bought, the things that had once defined her as lacking began to rearrange. The rumor of success moved up the mountain roads, and someone eventually took notice who would alter the simple ledger of Valentina's days. A vaquero named Jacinto passed through town on business and saw her stacked rounds in the shade. He had worked the hill country for long afternoons, and he recognized the subtle trueness of a product that started with honest milk and was finished with care. He nodded to himself and climbed back on his horse, the idea lodged in him like a thorn. There were evenings when Valentina sat outside the queseria and taught herself to count in a new way. Not just the hours of work, but the speed at which life rearranged when you turned your hands to craft. A single cow had been a mockery in the mouths of her uncles. For her, it became a hinge. When the first rainy season came, it battered the valley and washed the road into a mess of ruts. Gitana learned to stand in the muddier fields with a kind of patient dignity no one could buy. The cheese sat under corrugated roofs to dry, and the sound of rain on metal was a steady metronome for the days. People came with umbrellas and coins. They came with questions about where she came from and what she intended to do. Valentina's answers were short, never grandiose. She would say, "We make what we can," and then hand over a wrapped wedge. Inside, Isabel would sometimes hum an old tune as she worked the press. The two of them formed a rhythm, an unlikely duet of youth and age, of hands learning from hands. In the evenings, Isabel would come to the window and light her pipe, and Valentina would watch the smoke make slow shapes in the lamplight. There were no promises in those shapes, only the steady accumulation of skill, and something that felt dangerously like a plan. The plan would have to wait its hour. The mountain had a way of keeping its own clock. But when Valentina lied awake and let the echoes of the market wash through her, she also felt a faint certainty that the men who had thought to write her out had made a mistake. They had left her with life. In the hands of someone who knew how to work, life could be a ledger of its own truth. If you're already moved by Valentina's courage, tap like and stay with us. Her story is only beginning. The morning they wrapped the first dozen wheels for sale, Isabel took a long breath and said nothing for a while. She watched Valentina as she brushed the rind with olive oil, the motion precise and deliberate. There was pride in the old woman's silence, but also a practical caution Valentina could feel like a cold stone. To build something in the face of theft required more than skill. It required allies and a memory of paper. The first few buyers were small-scale, bakers and housewives, a cafe owner who liked to tout local goods, but one of those small bites began to attract a new kind of attention. The taste of the cheese traveled, first by word and then by invitation. A man with neat shoes came to the market one afternoon and asked, almost offhand, where they made the cheese that tasted like the countryside. When Don Arturo mentioned Valentina's name, the man's eyes brightened with a hunger that had nothing to do with appetite. "A sample," he said. "Send a sample to Guadalajara. I'm Felipe Aguilar. I run a small distribution there. We pay well and we like story." The idea of a buyer from the city was at once thrilling and complicated. To ship a few rounds meant money for feed, perhaps the second cow she had been dreaming about in the quiet nights. It also meant exposure into a world that measured value differently, by contracts, by invoices, by a delicate faith in brands. Valentina felt the weight of it like a scale. Isabel, who had seen more offers than she cared to remember, watched with a guarded face. "We will try," Isabel said finally, "but we do not bind ourselves to promises we cannot keep." The exchange of a single wheel for a contract felt, in its smallness, like a wager. It was a step that could expand a life, but it also exposed the edges. When Jacinto came back down the mountain on a later afternoon and reported to a friend in Santa Clara that the girl they'd thrown out had made something worth notice, the message landed in a place it would not be wise to ignore. The news of a small, stubborn success moves in a valley the way a gust moves through grass. It brushes the stems and wakes what is underneath. Valentina, who had once been a child with no title and a cardboard suitcase, folded a note into her coat pocket and went to help Don Arturo buy flour. She let the idea of growth sit in her chest like a seed, and she turned it every way possible. It would require hiring a hand, learning to keep accounts, building a reliable route. It would require keeping careful watch on the people who measured her worth not by bread given, but by an old, cold tally: ownership. There were nights when she imagined less practical things, what it would mean to walk back up the road to the hacienda and stand on the porch with a wheel of cheese in hand, to offer it as payment for what had been taken. She knew, in the steadiness of her truth, that a confrontation born of spite would be hollow. The remedy she wanted was not revenge. It was a restoration of what papers had stolen. She wanted a home where a girl could become a woman without being erased. The valley itself taught her. People gathered at daytime markets not to pity, but to strike bargains. They watched the press with a respectful curiosity and asked practical questions. How much milk for a wheel? How long to dry? How do you keep the flavor? Valentina answered with measures and the cadence of a learner who had become a teacher in the span of a few months. Each answer was the scaffolding of a business. Yet the mountain keeps a slow memory. The men who had taken her house had not been extinguished from the ledger of life. They existed like a returning tide, sometimes a rumor, sometimes a shadow. They were, she knew, patient and certain in the ease of their rights. When news of her small successes climbed the roads and reached the ears of Santa Clara, it stirred something in them that was not fond. An itch of reclaiming that was not about property, but about stored pride and the way their identity had been wrapped around possession. For now, though, the queseria was a small cove of intense labor, and Valentina clung to each day like a bead on a string. She learned to read a curd the way some people read handwriting. She learned when to salt and when to hold back. She learned the sound of the press when it would protest and when it would give in to the slow, inevitable squeeze. She learned patience was itself a form of wealth. At the end of one long day, as the sun lowered itself like an ember behind the hills, Isabel and Valentina sat on the low steps outside the queseria. The valley spread before them, dotted with lights like small promises. Gitana grazed a few yards away, tail flipping. Valentina thought of Elena folding linen and whispering instructions as if her hands could pass knowledge like heirlooms. "You want something bigger?" Isabel said quietly, the words a careful testing. "A house fixed, a place where people learn. You want more than a press and a cow. That is good. But you must learn the other part of the craft. How to keep your papers in order, how to make people who would profit from you speak their names in ink. Valentina listened. She had not yet the language of lawyers, but she had the scale of what needed to be done. Gather witnesses, keep receipts, document deliveries. She put her hand on Gitana's flank, feeling the cow's calm heartbeat under her palm. For the first time since the coffin had been lowered and the house sealed, a vision of the future was not entirely a thing stolen. It was a plan with steps. They rose to go in and finish the curds for the next day. The press creaked its old song as they turned the screw. There was grease on their palms and a small ache in their shoulders that felt like proof. Outside, a pickup's tires crunched on the dirt road. Valentina heard the sound and glanced up, expecting perhaps a customer, perhaps a courier with materials. But the vehicle's driver was someone else, a man on horseback who had come down from the higher slopes, his hat at the back of his head, dust streaking his boots. He rode slowly past the queseria, and his eyes took in the stacked wheels of cheese like a measure. He tipped his hat to them, and the nod was not a greeting. It was a small act of recognition that carried a weight. Stories move, and men remember. Valentina didn't know then how many reckoning steps would follow from that nod. She only knew the present. The press was ready for another round. The copper shone with the glow of work, and the scent of salted milk made the air taste like industry. She felt the tired, good kind of tired that comes from doing necessary things. When she closed the press and wrapped the wheel, she felt the small solidity of the thing in her hands. It was not just food. It was an answer to a question that had been forming since the day they pushed her onto the road. It was, in its way, an act of defiance. It said quietly that what had been taken had not been total. It said that a life could be recovered by the rigorous gathering and giving back of labor. The sun slid behind the hills. Isabel snuffed a cigarette and blew smoke into the evening. Valentina, younger by many seasons, held the wrapped wheel like a small hot star. She did not know yet what measure of trouble the success would attract. She did not know that the men who had taken her house were watching the valley's rumor mill and would come eventually to test the limits of what she had built. She only knew the truth of the moment: a cow, a press, and a girl with hands that had decided to do the work. The nod that Jacinto had given as he rode past the queseria did more than pass along a notice. It set a weather system in motion. From Santa Clara to the valley, news curved like a blade and lodged in the skulls of men for whom possession was part prayer and proof. When Jacinto returned to the higher trails, he spoke without malice, simply recounting what he'd seen: stacked wheels, a girl who worked like someone who had learned to keep accounts in her hands, an elderly woman who guarded the press. Facts, offered plain, have a way of turning into imperatives for those who believe they own the past. Ricardo read the rumor the way someone reads a summons. Mateo and Bruno read it as an insult. Pride is an easy tinder. Greed is the spark. They did not plan a public argument at first. Their thoughts were quieter and more practiced. What parts of the hacienda might be reclaimed, which animals belonged, and could be taken without papers being questioned, how to intimidate a girl and an old woman into handing over what they wanted. They considered pride the same way they considered title deeds, an asset to be defended. Valentina did not know these calculations had begun. Her days sped into rhythms of work and small triumphs. With Fernando Aguilar's offer, tentative at first, then firm, things shifted. The first shipment to Guadalajara went on a cloudy morning. Wrapped wheels were loaded onto a rickety van and driven on a road that remembered the weight of weather. The order arrived with comments about flavor, texture, the authentic thing urban buyers wanted to believe they were getting. Payment came back with a check, and with it came the first serious cash flow: feed for Gitana, a second cow, a humble ledger book to be kept under Isabel's bench. It was the ledger more than the cows that would later prove decisive. The ledger would be the map from a life without paper into one with evidence. But at the time, Valentina kept the ledger in her head and the half-filled book under Isabel's bench as something heavy and tentative, like a learning child. The market confrontation came like a ripple made by a thrown stone. It was a Saturday when the square had a different heat to it. Vendors louder, customers with more bustle, and Don Arturo hawking a special bread for a wedding. Valentina had stacked a small heap of wheels beneath a sunshade. The cheese smelled faintly of herbs that someone had added, of a labor honed to a point. Ricardo arrived with Matteo and Bruno in a sour cloud. They did not come quietly. They stepped into the market as if it were theirs by right, their boots announcing them before their faces cleared the crowd. The shock in the square was immediate. Valentina had seen Ricardo once in a town crossing 3 months earlier, but she had not expected to see him among the stalls as an accuser. The market women muttered. Don Arturo straightened, flower on his sleeve. Ricardo's voice rose with a practiced indignation. "This is ours," he said. "That cow, that business, she has no right. She was left with a single animal and they made a circus out of it. Where is the respect for family?" He held up a yellowed paper, the edges soft with age and thumb-smudged from being shown and waved and shown again. "They say it's settled. There's a document." The words were meant to smear a truth into a new shape. Valentina met him without theatrics. She kept the ledger in her pocket and the quiet in her jaw. She had learned how to set her face into business when needed. "You signed nothing that gave you this," she answered. Her voice did not shake. Market ears turned inward. "You took what wasn't yours. If you have a problem, take it to the courts." Matteo scoffed and leaned forward, wanting the argument to put her off balance. He spoke with the kind of casual cruelty learned over years of feeling entitled. "She's a nobody with a cow. Who will believe her?" That was the point where the square split into 100 currents. Some people stepped back as if the air itself had thickened. Others edged in, alarmed at the spectacle being made. Doña Remedios, who had first pointed Valentina toward Isabel, stepped forward like a small, bright defiance. "She has more proof than your pride," she said. Her voice carried the weight of local gossip and record-keeping. She knew debts, she knew who owed who for what, and she kept names in order. The crowd's murmuring became a kind of court of its own, one that would later be summoned into a formal process. Don Arturo, who had never been quick to anger, told Ricardo in an even voice that the bakery sheltered people who worked for it and did not endorse thievery. "We do not condone threats in our market," he said, wiping his hands on an apron. He did not insult Ricardo. He simply informed him that the community had eyes and memories. The confrontation ended with threats murmured and doors that had not yet closed. Ricardo departed, trying to make spectacle pass for ownership. His men circled like coiled things. But the market had seen him. The square had been a public place where aggression takes on a new meaning because everyone is watching. In Santa Clara, a record is a rumor. Here it had been a moment of exposure. That exposure did not satisfy Matteo and Bruno. Shame mutates into determination. The night raid they planned was slower, more calculated. Take what they believed was theirs before Valentina could gather documents, before a lawyer could file a claim, before a city buyer could make the enterprise too visible to unmake. They would not be the first to think a night raid an easy remedy, but their plan underestimated 2 things: Isabel's willingness to defend what she valued and the way a community, once called, would stand. The attack came on a moonless night. The ranch road held a metallic hush. Valentina was in a second, short sleep under the press roof. Gitana grazed close by, tethered. Isabel had retired to her room in an adjacent lean-to with the old shotgun leaned against the bedpost, a habit developed in years when threats were handled like things that could be named and kept at bay. Her decision to have it there was not one of bravado. It was precaution. In the valleys, precautions are as ordinary as keeping salt by the door. Valentina woke to the sound that rises when a place's rhythm is broken, the clatter of soft boots, a muttered voice, the sharp slice of a gate being forced. For a moment, she thought it was wind. Then Gitana stamped and the cow's low alarm broke the night, not loud but impossible to ignore. Valentina's bones went suddenly very alert. She moved before she could rationalize. Outside, shadows moved like hands. Men came with ropes and hunger in their shoulders. Matteo and Bruno led them, faces set with the cruelty of men certain of their role. They were not bluffing. They shoved toward the corrals with the same unwanted entitlement they had used to send a girl down the road months before. Isabel was already at the threshold before she had time to think of the sentence she would shout. Her shotgun was in her hands with a kind of slow, precise motion. She stepped into the night like someone who had read the chapter and knew where the knife would come. Her voice under the sky was the sound of worn authority. "Back," she said. The word folded very tightly against the cold. What happened next was not filmic heroics. It was desperate work and ordinary courage. Isabel called out the names of people in the village who had business at the queseria. She banged on doors. The sound of her voice, sharp, commanding, wafted through the valley and found neighbors who had their own sense of what counted as justice. People emerged. Don Arturo with a lantern, a few market women with shawls thrown on in the dark, and Jacinto, who had been gambling at a small cantina down the road and who came at full speed when he heard a story that required a horse and not a rumor. The attackers had expected the dark and a soft prize. They did not expect to meet a wall of human presence. The first exchange was not a battle. It was a confused scuffle that could have devolved quickly into harm. Isabel, holding the shotgun like an instrument of last resort, banged it on the ground in a motion that made the nearest man flinch. Her voice was a bell. "You will go. There will be witnesses." Mateo lunged. A woman from the market stepped between them, shawl flung like a human barricade. Don Arturo pulled at a rope that had been looped around a gate to distract a man who was trying to cut it free. The scuffle was enough to slow the attackers. People from neighboring houses, men and women, came with torches and the certain knowledge that this place, the queseria and the corral and the press, belonged to someone who had earned a place in the town's moral ledger by labor and honesty. Small communities like this use their own muscles to defend what is right in the absence of swift authorities. The police arrived in a flurry that felt overdue but decisive. They were not dramatized heroes. They were functionaries who processed an event and made choices. They separated sides, took statements, and arrested those who had been caught with ropes and coins and the intent to steal. The law, in its slow and often clumsy way, was present. Arrests were made. Mateo and Bruno were cuffed with a stunned expression that made them look suddenly very mortal. Ricardo, who had not come for the night attack, showed up at the perimeter like a man drawn to the noise he had made in his own head. In the morning, the town's gossip had a new skeleton: the raid, the community's response, Isabel's shotgun, the police. People walked slower, feeling like witnesses to the change of a tense scene into legal record. The neighborhood had decided in that moment that theft could not be shrouded in privacy if it wore a face known to many. The legal process that followed was less dramatic on the surface and more consequential in the long view. Licenciado Mendoza, sharp, precise, and known for an appetite for defending the underdog when someone was willing to pay the practical price of truth, took the case. Don Arturo, Doña Remedios, Jacinto, and a baker from Guadalajara provided statements. Mendoza interviewed them carefully, like a man assembling a mosaic from many small tiles. The pivotal piece would be finding the notary who had certified the documents that Ricardo and his brothers had waved like a banner. That notary had been a figure in the town long enough to carry both respect and the capacity for compromise. When Mendoza walked into his office, he did not flinch. He presented the notary with facts, dates, witness statements, the doubt in signatories' hands. The notary's face, which had been very practiced in the art of being a neutral scribe, went slack. The burden of being a man who had once bent a pen for profit was a weight that has a way of settling in. This is the part where the story requires the slow, stubborn work of evidence. The notary did not confess out of theatricality. He confessed because the ledger of witnesses and the legal pressure were a net, and he was caught in it. He admitted that he had been paid to make signatures appear legitimate. The confession was not a tidy absolution. It was a legal statement that would be recorded and used as a fulcrum. It could be used because there were witnesses, market sellers, the municipal doctor who had certified details about Elena's death, and receipts that showed the reality of Valentina's business purchases. Last recorded deliveries from the queseria could be traced. The documents Ricardo had used did not match the weight of facts. The court process was earnest and not romantic. There were hearings and depositions and muddled days when bureaucracy felt like the only antagonist left. Licenciado Mendoza moved through it with a patient ferocity. He called witnesses, cross-examined the notary, and produced the medical certification that showed Elena's final days and the discrepancy between what the notary had certified and what reality had been. Testimony from Don Arturo and Doña Remedios, from the woman who had once seen Elena sign a note, all knitted a case. Ricardo and his brothers offered a defense warmed by entitlement, the old line that life had been arranged in their favor, and that loss of property was loss of legacy. But the law has a way of flattening those narratives when evidence is presented. The notary's confession was a pivot. The ledger of deliveries and the community's witnesses were the load-bearing walls. The judge did not decide out of passion. She decided out of fact. The ruling declared the documents fraudulent and ruled that the hacienda be restored. Sentencing followed, modest but meaningful. Fines and time, a legal recognition that theft had consequences. Valentina's reaction was not an uncontained joy. It was, as she had learned in the months of hard labor, a measured thing. There was satisfaction, a quiet muscle in her chest easing. She went to the hacienda with people who had stood with her, Doña Isabel, Licenciado Mendoza, Don Arturo, and walked the yard like someone taking account of what to mend. The house itself had the tired, sagging look of a thing that had been lived in by different hands. Rooms were rearranged, photographs hung oddly, and the garden had been trampled in places where people had let themselves think they owned more than they did. Restitution did not arrive as some chest of gold. It arrived as a legal piece that allowed Valentina to choose. She walked through rooms that smelled of dust and other people's laundry and felt the memory of Elena in a way that was almost physical. She could reclaim it all and try to remake the house into a home. She could sell what she did not need and buy more cows. She could walk out and leave it as a field of what had been. She made a choice that surprised those who had watched her. She decided not to return to the house as the sole, pale act of a person reclaiming a birthright. She went instead to the hill, back to the queseria where the press had smoothed away into a history, and drafted a plan with Doña Isabel, Licenciado Mendoza, and Don Arturo. They would create a business that had legal solidity, community ownership, and an educational arm. Mendoza and Morales would be the name under which they operated, a nod to the council that had restored them and the woman who had taught them. The hacienda would be restored with part of the property and funds but reimagined. Valentina used restoration funds to fix the house, but kept a portion dedicated to the Hill Project. New presses, an expansion of the curing rooms, hiring locals, and opening a small school where girls and boys could learn the craft of cheesemaking alongside agricultural literacy, bookkeeping, and labor rights. It was an act of restitution extended outward, an intentional reallocation that made the victory resonant rather than private. The expansion required numbers and patience. Fernando Aguilar became more than a buyer. He became a partner in distribution, connecting Mendoza and Morales to a network in Guadalajara that allowed modest but steady growth. Orders increased. They improved the sanitary protocols, bought a small van for transport, and formalized delivery schedules. The business did not explode overnight. It grew by degrees. 2 cows became 5, 5 became a dozen, and the queseria's signature wheels found their way to more tables. They hired local hands, a young man from the outskirts who had previously worked as a laborer in town, a woman who had a knack for rind, a teacher who volunteered at the school. Doña Isabel, whose life had once been defined by solitude and a stubborn fidelity to an old craft, found a renewed purpose in guiding apprentices. She used the shotgun less and her hands more, teaching the turning of the press and the story of patience. It was not sentimentality. It was work that ripened into dignity. The press that had groaned in Valentina's early days now creaked more serenely, its wood oiled and its screw greased to a patient hum. The legal penalties for Ricardo and his brothers meant they could not simply reclaim without consequence. Sentences were served in the measured way of a legal system that had done its job. Testimony had mattered, truth had been recorded, and there were fines and a period of community service prescribed by the court. Their letter of regret, Ricardo's letter, arrived months later, a brittle thing folded into an envelope, and handed to Valentina by a courier who would not meet her eyes. It read with the practiced language of contrition written by people who had lost more than property. They had lost the permission to act without consequence. In it, Ricardo spoke of mistakes and a desire for peace. Valentina kept the letter folded in a drawer. It did not change what had happened. It was not an absolution. She read it once, let it rest, and then decided it would be private, an artifact that would not be used to burnish her public story. Life after the trial was not a fairy tale. There were days when markets fell silent because of droughts, when cheese would not age as planned, when a shipment delayed and customers called with impatience. There were also days when the school chimed with children learning to stir curds and list to accounts, and when an older woman who had never had steady work came in for an afternoon and left with an honest wage and a lighter chest. Success became measured not by a single check, but by how people in a valley found themselves with new options. One ritual that remained through those years was Valentina's care for Gitana. The cow aged with the same endurance as her maker's appetite for life. Her flank grayed a little at the eyes, and her steps slowed like a memory. People would come and ask about the cow that had been an odd inheritance and turned into a matriarch. Children would bring scraps and watch her chew like a slow machine. Valentina would sometimes stand and touch the cow's shoulder and remember the day she walked away from a house with nothing but a cardboard suitcase. Gitana's presence in the pasture was a quiet lesson. Life, given care, yields returns beyond any neat ledger. The company pivoted into social planning. They set aside a small fund to help women reclaim property rights, informational sessions, assistance with filing claims, and a small legal aid portion funded by the cheese profits and a municipal grant. Mendoza and Morales was not only a brand, it became a community institution. The school they opened within 2 years taught children how to read a label and understand a balance sheet as much as how to care for a press. It was an inheritance of knowledge rather than paper. A few years later, Fernando Aguilar expanded his contract into a regional distribution partnership. He helped them place their product into boutique stores and a select number of restaurants in Guadalajara. The brand retained its local name and the stories, Isabel's Press, the girl with the suitcase, Gitana, but what made the products desirable was not the narrative alone. It was craftsmanship, consistency, and a rigorous approach to quality. People paid for the truth of that labor. Not all relationships smoothed out. Ricardo's repentance did not make him a welcome guest at the queseria. He attempted once to meet with Valentina, saying the words out loud in the community center, a public space that felt more civil than any porch could. Valentina listened with an even face. She did not invite him into the business. She offered instead a practical act. If he wished to make restitution, he could volunteer and show a willingness to learn a trade and to work under supervision. Ricardo refused. Some offers that could have led to small reconciliations evaporated into old habits. There were small triumphs along the way that were not the stuff of headlines, but mattered to the valley. A young woman who had apprenticed under Isabel became master of the press after years of practice. She took over the morning rounds and trained others. A bakery in a neighboring town started to order during wedding seasons, and a school across the county asked for a steady supply for its cafeterias. They exported to a few select retailers and an artisan cheese shop that prized provenance. Valentina learned to balance attention between caring for her animals and charting financial growth. She kept a small room in the ranch house for work, and a larger one at the queseria for teaching. The partnership she formed with Doña Isabel was formalized as Mendoza and Morales. The name recognized the legal counsel that had helped restore the property and the matriarch who had taught the art. The business model included a cooperative arm that paid workers a living wage and offered training and childcare stipends during harvest season. Valentina became a visible leader, not because she sought attention, but because the job required clear decisions and the town needed a person to hold the center when choices were made. Time tilted things in ways that felt both inevitable and particular. 3 years after the verdict, Valentina stood on a small platform at the opening of the school's first term and watched children run across the yard with painted tins of milk as if they were trophies. The school's sign was simple and hand-painted, Escuela de Queso y Tierra. The crowd applauded with the sort of warmth that will make a leader's chest ache in a good way. Licenciado Mendoza sat in the front row, small and attentive, his hands folded like a man who had watched his client translate victory into stewardship. Valentina did not crave a podium. She accepted it as a responsibility. In the speech she gave, she spoke of food and work and the stubbornness of people who refused to be erased. She did not use grand pronouncements. She spoke plainly of the press and of the way tasks build character and community. She looked at Isabel, who sat rocking a little, hair like silver thread, and found her eyes. The old woman's face held a kind of quiet pride that did not need to be amplified. Years later, in a stretch of time where the valley had more visitors and more carts bringing goods for trade, Valentina walked with a younger apprentice to the corral. They stopped by Gitana's resting place, a small clearing shaded by a mesquite. The cow had lived beyond the average for her breed, and had given more calves than any ledger could comfortably count. Valentina ran her hand along the curve of Gitana's flank, feeling the warmth like a memory that persisted. The business had grown in ways that mattered to the community. More employment, a stable market connection to Guadalajara, a microcredit fund for small farmers, and a courtyard where people could come and learn trades. They also began modestly packaging for export. an order to a specialty importer who wanted an authentic story balanced with sanitary rigor. The label was careful. Not a bill of miracle, but a record of craft. There was an afternoon when the valley held the kind of light that turned every dusty path into something like a painting. Valentina and Isabel sat on the low wall that looked over the fields, their hands folded and unafraid of small reportings. The press was quieter now, taken over by a younger pair of hands that knew the screws language as well as any elders. They watched the sun lower and threw shade over a land that had once felt like a map of losses. "You did not need me to teach you courage," Isabel said, the words as laconic as a gust. "You had it all along in some stubborn place." Valentina smiled then, a sound like a small bell. "You taught me the craft," she answered. "You taught me how to wait and how to press. Those two things," she said, "are nearly the same." They sat in companionable silence, watching a group of children chase a stray ball through the grass and a new class file being carried in by a teacher who would go on to teach the next generation. In one of her pockets, tucked between an accounting stub and a dried herb, Valentina kept the small fragment of her mother's rebozo. It had faded further with years, the color grown quiet, but she touched it sometimes like one touches a wound that has healed into a scar. It remained a reminder of origin and purpose. Gitana's last years were calm and dignified. When she finally died, natural, in the way that makes sense for older animals, Valentina did not dramatize. There was grief, quiet and earned, and then a small ceremony in the pasture where folks who once traded for milk and bought cheese came with flowers and handfuls of feed. They buried Gitana on a small slope facing the valley so that, in death, she would look on the place she had helped rebuild. People spoke in low voices, offering thanks in the ways the valley knew how. A shared loaf, a prayer whispered from habit rather than doctrine. Elena's rebozo folded like a soft memory and placed on a box by the graveside, a private nod to lineage. The success of Mendoza and Morales had opportunities and temptations. Offers for acquisition came and were politely rejected. The aim had never been to sell a story and vanish. It had been to make something sustainable. Valentina remained adamant that the mission must be to maintain roots while offering growth. The cooperative remained small enough that a misstep would be visible and correctable. They instituted regular meetings and an annual transparency report delivered to the town, modest, accountable, real. A decade after she had been pushed out of her home with nothing but a cow and a cardboard suitcase, Valentina walked through the open gates of the hacienda one afternoon. Not to reclaim as a sovereign ruler, but to open a new program. They had renovated one wing into a community center for women who needed to understand labor laws and the right to documentation. She stood in the shade of a veranda and felt the house's breath. The house was a home now in a different sense. It hosted people who had no title but had the right to learn how to assert themselves. A small parcel of the land, preserved in the legal deeds, had been turned into a public orchard, with fruit trees planted by schoolchildren. It was a daily proof against forgetfulness. They had not simply taken back a building. They had built structures that made the town less vulnerable to the sort of private predation that had once erased a girl's life. Not every story had a neat reconciliation. Ricardo died years later, of health complications and a conscience that was never quite healed. He sent a second letter that was, again, private. There was no public eulogy from Valentina. She had learned that some losses require no final spectacle. The law had balanced things as much as it could. The rest was human history, complicated and unresolved. In the end, what the Valley had learned from Valentina's stubbornness was not the myth of a single person pulling themselves by the bootstraps. It was the quieter truth that when a community remembers, keeps records, and is willing to show up, injustice becomes harder to naturalize. The press and the cow had been the seeds. The real harvest was knowledge shared, livelihoods secured, and a schoolyard where children could learn the value of craft. The sun set the way it always had, in slow, unapologetic washes of gold. Valentina and Isabel stood together beside the press one last time as the day gave in. In the distance, the hacienda roof caught the light like a small promise. Below them, the valley hummed, carts returning, a dog barking far off, the steady human sound of a life being made again. Valentina thought of the cardboard suitcase and the road and how the world had seemed to tilt under her feet. She thought of Elena's hands and the sound of a press yielding to patience. She thought of the mornings when milk steamed in her palms and the times she had almost given up. Above all, she thought of work done openly, of the way labor became a witness against theft. Doña Isabel, who had led with a hand that could be both rough and guiding, took Valentina's arm in a way that made no fuss of it. "We are not owed anything," she said softly. "We are given much work, and we return it to others." Valentina nodded. The words were more true than any blazing speech. They looked at the valley that had been rebuilt like a quilt stitched by many hands. When the night finally fell and the lamps were lit, Valentina climbed the small ridge above the ranch and sat with the old rebozo folded on her lap. She wrote a short note, no grand manifestos, thanking those who had stood, those who had testified, those who had given small things like an extra loaf or a night by a corral. She folded the note into a simple envelope and placed it at the foot of Gitana's grave, a private ritual of gratitude. The valley continued. Children learned to milk, others learned to press. A new generation of artisans tasted the benefits of hard-won rights. Mendoza and Morales paid wages and taught reading lists. The orchard bore fruit. The school chimed each morning. And when travelers asked about the name, the people in the valley would tell the straightforward story. A girl left with nothing but a cow chose to make that thing into a life, and in doing so she taught a community how to bind themselves together. In the last light, Valentina thought of the odd arithmetic of inheritance. They had tried to erase her with ink. She had answered with a different kind of accounting: labor, witness, patience. That was what made the story sturdy. It was a ledger not of titles, but of people. If this story moved you, write refuge in the comments and subscribe for more stories of people who turn loss into something that lasts.